Okay, should we just get started with this video? I was kind of waiting for these little light fairies to go away, but really I'm just stalling because it's so hard to narrow down 100 books to my top 10 of 2020, but we're gonna try. Welcome everybody to Too Cool for Middle School. My name is Megan. This year I read 100 books. I documented it all on this channel and on Instagram. So on this channel, every time I read 10 books, I made a little review video. So I have 10 videos from 2020 with book reviews. So you can see all of those here. Also, pretty much every time I read a book, I posted about it on Instagram and did a little review there, and you can find all of those by searching the hashtag Too Cool for Middle School Books. So we've done like the documentation. Now we have to edit it down to my 10 favorite books of 2020. This is so hard for me because clearly I can be like very thorough, like finish something from beginning to end, but then when you ask me to start making choices, I'm like, oh, okay. This part is much harder for me. So the kind of method that I decided on, just to give myself like some boundaries. So I'm gonna take every 10 and just choose one from that 10. So I'm gonna choose one from each of the 10 books that I read this year and pick a favorite. Oh my gosh, it's gonna be so hard. I'm probably gonna throw in some honorable mentions just because I won't be able to handle it otherwise. Just quickly before we get started, I keep track in this little bullet journal. This was also supposed to be for like my YouTube videos. That didn't last past January. Teachers pay teachers stuff. Oh, I just never started on that. Cool. But I did do the book section. So every time I read a book, I just wrote it down. I do have a BookReads account as well. I just usually forget to go on it. I should probably do that, but you know, it was just fun to do it this way. And every time I would close a book, I would run over here and get out my little journal and write it down. I was also counting up like kind of by genre. So basically it was split into thirds. About a third of the books that I read were nonfiction, another third were young adult fiction, and the other third were just like adult fiction. So we've got a pretty good mix here. Okay, I'm gonna stop stalling. So my first favorite book of the year, here are the 10 options. Out of these 10, my favorite was The Book of Lost Saints. Also Little Gods and Unsheltered, but let's talk about The Book of Lost Saints. It was the second book that I read this year, and I feel like it really set me on the path towards reading more adult fiction, and it introduced me to the genre of like magical realism. So what I really liked about this book is that it's set mostly in Cuba. It's been a while since I read it, so I can't remember the main character's name, but he is kind of like visited in his dreams by his aunt, I think. And she's giving him clues about his family's past. So they now live in the United States, but they're from Cuba. And so he goes back there to kind of uncover some of the secrets of his family. I really love reading fiction where I also end up just learning about a different place or a different time, just kind of as a side effect. And that definitely happens in this book. So you learn a lot about Cuba and Cuban history, and it's just very, very well done. I love Daniel Jose Older as an author. He also does young adult books. So I definitely recommend The Book of Lost Saints. Okay, book number 2. Here were the options. And out of all of these, I'm going to pick Such a Fun Age. This was another really interesting one because so many people were reading it that I followed on Instagram and everything, and like a lot of people just kind of picked it up all at the same time. So it was fun to feel like we were sort of reading it in like an unofficial book club. I was also reading it as I was watching the series version of Little Fires Everywhere, and those two stories have a lot of really similar themes. They're both looking at these relationships between kind of like neurotic, organized, control freak white women who, you know, from the outside seem very successful, and their reliance upon a younger Black woman who is a little bit less like financially stable, has less of society's markers of success in her life. She's a little bit more flexible and able to just like help this lady. And it's just kind of like a weird and interesting relationship to look at. And it's just so very well written. You get really invested in the characters and you just really think about your own life and your own purpose and your own reliance upon other people. Kylie Reed is an excellent writer, so I can't wait to read more from her. In the running for book number 3 are these right here. Honorable mentions, of course, Aristotle and Dante, and then Kent State. I recommend so highly. Just go watch my review of that book. But I am gonna go with Wild Swans because it was one of the longest books that I read this year, and it was one that I was just so invested in. It's a true multi-generational story of the author's grandmother and then her mother and then herself. So her grandmother lives in China during the years of the Japanese occupation, and she was like a concubine for one of the Chinese officers, and then her mother grew up during, Mao's reign and during communism. And then the third part of the book is like the author's story, and it's just so fascinating. You learn so much about Chinese history that I didn't know, and it comes from such a personal place. And where I teach, a lot of my students' families are from China, and so they might have like similar stories in those generations before them. And it just helped me to understand some of the perspectives about school and about family and about even like coming to the United States. And I definitely learned more about Chinese history from that book than any other book that I've ever read. I feel like it's actually pretty difficult to find books about Chinese history, and then this one is just so well written and so good and so engaging that I just think it's excellent, and I would recommend it to everybody. Oh my gosh, this collection is so hard to choose from. Before I tell you which one I'm choosing, everybody go read Stamped, get it for your classroom. Also read Parachutes, also read The Vanishing Half, also read Clap When You Land. I loved Once Upon an Eid, but I am going with Deacon King Kong. I have found a new favorite author in James McBride. I loved watching the Instagram live that he did with Amory after we read this for Amory's book club. This book is set in New York in like the 1960s. Is it magical realism? There's a little bit of magical realism within it, only because this guy like talks to his dead wife a lot. The premise is a little bit weird. It's just this guy who is like drunk all the time and he is trying to find the collection money, and only his wife would know where that is. It's all kind of like centered around the community church. So you really get to know all of these just like really interesting characters within his orbit, but then he also goes and works in the garden of this other lady who is like Irish, I believe. There's like a big, divide between like the Irish and the Italians, I think. And the one guy is like a cop. So you just learn a lot about like how neighborhoods were in New York in the 60s, and like the mafia is all intertwined in everything. And this takes place in like the time and the neighborhoods where my in-laws grew up in New York. And so like that was just really cool for me to just kind of get a little fictional peek into what it might have been like growing up then. But I just loved this book. There's such cool information in it, but it's also just so fun. So I definitely recommend it. The next group of contenders we have right here, and my favorite of the bunch, one of my favorites of the year, was Caucasia by DAZEY Senna. This one was just so well written. I mean, at this point, let's see, this was like the 45th book that I had read this year, and I was still so blown away by her writing. It just really just like elevated itself above a lot of the other writing that I read this year, and the story is really weird also. I love a weird story. There is a husband and wife. This is like the 70s, I think, and the wife is white, the husband is black, and then they have 2 daughters, and one of them is darker like her father, and then one of them is lighter like the mother. And they end up having to go their separate ways for like safety reasons for a while. And so one kind of lives as a white girl and one lives as a black girl. A little bit similar to The Vanishing Half, which I read earlier in the year and also recommend, but this one is, takes place like later in time. And yeah, it's hard to put my finger on why it's so good, but I was sad when it was over. I just like wanted to stay in this world and find out more about what happened to these girls. I wanted to know more about what happened to the mom. Not everybody will probably feel this way, but I do feel like I know women like that mom and men like the dad, and just to see like their stories taken to the extreme and to read about a possibility of what that life is like was just so interesting to me, and I really, really love the cover as well. This next set of books is very nonfiction heavy, and so the one that I'm going to recommend, oh my gosh, it was just so, so good. But I do also recommend all of these biographies, but let's go with The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. Stephen Graham Jones is a genius. I didn't realize he was so prolific, that he had written so many books. I thought maybe this was one of his first books just because I hadn't heard much about him, but he's written a lot. He writes mostly horror. I don't read a lot of horror, but this one was really, really good. It's from the perspective of these three friends who grew up on a reservation. I think two of them stayed. No, one of them stays. One of them, his story kind of ends early on in the book, and then there's another one who ends up kind of making his way back to the reservation. The three of them did something as teenagers that haunts them into their lives in the future. It's a little bit strange that, like, these three characters aren't treated with kid gloves at all. Like they're haunted for like a bad deed because they went against tradition. So it does bring up questions like that for Indigenous peoples, who are still living on the reservation or even off, but like how much tradition do you keep? What things can you kind of let go of now in the 21st century? But will there be unforeseen consequences for abandoning those traditions or breaking those rules? And Stephen Graham Jones just uses horror as a way to explore that. Like, okay, well, what if we're haunted by the souls of the animals or whatever, if we do something like this. So that's one thing that I really appreciate and enjoy about horror, is that it's always about something else. It's always a metaphor, but you just take something scary and use that in place of something else. And so then, the story is just very dramatic and exciting, and you want to keep reading. The other thing about this book was that he is so good at explaining, just using imagery to describe a one-on-one basketball game. I've never read anyone who can do that before. That was just mind-blowing to me. If you played basketball, in high school, or you still play or whatever right now, you absolutely get it. You understand every little detail that he's describing. It's just so, so, so good. So again, even if you don't really like horror like me, I would still recommend this book because it's so good and just such an interesting way to get at some of these questions. The next set right here has so many good ones. Transcendent Kingdom was amazing. When No One's Watching is amazing. But I am going to go with We Ride Upon Sticks. That was my 70th read of the year, and in that video I said that it was my favorite so far, and yeah, it is. It absolutely makes its way into the top 10. It's just a combination of so many weird things. So it's set in the early 90s in Massachusetts, and all of the characters are part of this high school field hockey team. So there's not really a narrator. The whole team is the narrator. It's all written we had a game versus whoever next week. And then each chapter gives you more of a glimpse into one of the players. And I just loved all of the characters in this book. They have kind of made a deal with the devil, who is Emilio Estevez in notebook form. And they have to do bad things, not really terrible things, but just like sneaky weird things in order to like keep up the magic and like keep winning the games. And it's all set against the backdrop of like the Salem witch trials because that's where they live. It's just so freaking cool. And I love the personalities of all the girls. Like they're not very catty. They're not overly friendly even like with each other. Like they're just teammates, and you know, there's like two that are best friends and maybe like another two that are best friends, and they all kind of become closer in different ways. One of them has, because it's, you know, the early 90s, like her bangs that are always hairsprayed up like this, and it's called the Claw, and that's like a character in the book. And then another one of the girls has like a red mark on her neck, kind of like a hickey, and that like becomes one of the characters in the book. So it's again kind of like magical realism. It's hilarious and just super unique and super funny, and it's one that I will read again. I have too many on my list to like read very many of them twice, but that is one that I will read again because I just enjoyed it so much. In this group right here, you definitely need to read The Dark Fantastic, but it's pretty specific to like secondary English teachers and fantasy writers. Still really good though. So my favorite author in this group, I read 2 of his books, was Hari Kunzru, and I think I'm gonna go with Red Pill. White Tears was also brilliant. So Hari Kunzru is just a mind-blowingly brilliant author. Reading his books is an experience. It is an experience unlike most of the other 98 books that I read this year. It's so unique. He again is one of those authors whose voices just like rings clear and separately from everybody else around him. The plots always get like a little bit dreamy and you're kind of like wondering what's real and what's going on. They're always firmly rooted in history, in reality, in like a critique of society, but it's revealed to you in these very like strange ways, and you don't even realize that it's being revealed to you until all of a sudden it just like hits you in the face and you're like, oh my goodness. They're very cerebral, and like I would love to see them as a movie but it would just be so weird. Like you would need just like a really weird director and a weird cast in order to make it work. But I would love to like see these books come to life. The Red Pill, as the name suggests, did like flip a switch in my brain and like kind of shove me into an existential crisis. And I talk more about it in the original book review video, but oh my gosh, you gotta read Hari Kunzru. Okay, this next set, every single person right now needs to read on immunity, like just go do that. But my favorite of the 10 was The Office of Historical Corrections. Oh my goodness, this book was so cool. It was different for me. It's a book of short stories all by the same author. I don't think I've ever really read books of short stories before, and then this year I've read like 10 books like that, but usually they're an anthology of like multiple authors. These are all by Danielle Evans. She is another one of my new favorite authors from this year, and this book is pretty much just like a masterclass in how to write short stories. So the final story is a little bit longer, and it's called The Office of Historical Corrections, and I loved it. It's almost like science fiction, but it's my brand of science fiction where in the future there's a specific department of the government and they hire this small group of like people with PhDs in history, and they go around and look at museums, statues, whatever, just anything that's like public history, and make sure that it's accurate and correct it if it's not. And there are consequences for this, because when people believe something about their own history or their town's history or whatever, they do not want to be corrected. They do not want to be bothered with historical fact. And one of the lines in there that's so funny is just, white people love their history right up until it's true. And as we've seen this play out with like Confederate statues and even like the slightest critique of white historical figures over the past year or so, we've seen these reactions. And so she just kind of explores what it would be like if you really did have an authority that could correct these things. And it's just so interesting. There's a twist at the end. I loved it. Oh my gosh, we are at the final 10. I just did a review of all of these. It's the most recent video on my channel, so you can check all of these out. This set is so hard to choose from. The House in the Cerulean Sea is so good. The Midnight Library is so amazing. And I have a really special place in my heart for A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor. But I am going to choose Being Human by Judith Heumann. You may have heard of her from the movie on Netflix, Crip Camp. That movie covers one like thread of the story of the disability rights activists in like the 1970s and 80s. And then Judy Heumann's book gives you even more insight into what it was like through her perspective, and the organizing that they did, and the strategizing, and the protests, and the sit-ins, and just the way that they listened to everybody. And they would take as much time as was required, you know, to listen to people who maybe speak a little bit more slowly because they have cerebral palsy, or they would, you know, wait to begin meetings until everybody was there because some people used wheelchairs or walkers or whatever. There were always interpreters for people who were deaf, and ways for blind people to access all of the information that they were talking about. And so just this beautiful blueprint of how things can be done when you care that everyone is included, when it's important to you to get the input from everybody around you. You'll find a way to do it. And because all of the people in this disability rights movement were so used to figuring out how to access things, figuring out how to, you know, get to your friend's house and knock on their door when you can't go up those steps if you're sitting in a wheelchair, because they were so used to coming up with creative solutions. They're just brilliant when it comes to political strategy and breaking down those barriers. And it's just, it definitely has changed me. And I'm so in awe of this movement and so fascinated by it, and it's a shame that I know very little about it, and that this movement isn't, you know, taught alongside the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War protests, because it is intrinsically linked to all of those things. So it's just excellent, and it's one that I'm going to be thinking about for a long time and going back to and referring to more, and then just reading more about in general. So there we go. These are my 10. It was hard to leave any out, but I stand fully behind these 10, and I recommend them to everybody. And if you've read any of these, I would love to talk about them with you in the comments. I'm also going to do a giveaway connected to this video over on Instagram, where I'll be giving away 2 of these books to people who haven't read them yet. So if you want to read one of these books and you want me to send it to you, then go over to Instagram and you'll see information over there about how to win one of these books. And after you've read it, then come back again and talk about it with me, because I love talking about books with you guys. Please let me know in the comments down below what your favorite book of the year was, if you can choose one, you know, maybe 2 or 3 if you can't narrow it down to 1. I cannot. I'm going with 10, okay? 10 is as small as I could get it. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for being on this book journey with me during 2020. This is like one of the few things that has been really fun for me and brought me tons of joy and happiness and a sense of fulfillment. So yeah, thanks for being a part of this, and I hope you have a great 2021. I hope all of us have a better 2021 than we did 2020, and we'll all be in there together. So